CASEL introduced the term social and emotional learning about 26 years ago. And since then, we have been in an ongoing process of learning, testing, refining, as we continue to advance and refine the definition of SEL itself. As things have evolved, we have seen a lot of variability around the understanding of not only what constitutes high quality, but how to implement SEL. And we see the need now to offer clarity around what is necessary to achieve the vision for SEL, for educators, for adults, and for young people everywhere, particularly those who have historically been marginalized. After 26 years, and as a growing field, we need to hold ourselves accountable to ensure that our intention for SEL matches the actual implementation on the ground. And I want to call out 4 things that some of our work has led us to prioritize. One is we need to be more explicit about how SEL can advance educational equity and excellence. We need to address issues of identity, agency, and belonging. We need to emphasize the many spaces and places where social and emotional learning can be promoted. And we need to infuse SEL into curriculum and instruction, into extracurricular activities, into discipline, student support services, professional learning, and ongoing assessment for continuous improvement. As a learning organization, we are committed to doing that work and to continuing to reflect and refine so that social and emotional learning can help us achieve the more just society and the world that I all know we want. I would like to share a quick thank you for the foundations that have directly invested in CASEL's learning. We really couldn't do the work without them. So I'd like to thank the Allstate Foundation, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, LG Electronics, New Profit, Novo Foundation, Pure Edge, Rakes Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Wallace Foundation. So on that note of gratitude, I'm grateful to be joined today by my team of vice presidents, Melissa Schlinger and Rob Jagers, to discuss some of the enhancements that we have made across our definitions and framework.
Hi, Rob. And before we get started, was there any additional historical context that you'd like to offer to set the stage for what we're going to get into today?
Sure. I think Karen did a nice job of kind of pointing to the continuous improvement work that we have been engaged in since the inception of social and emotional learning. Referring to that literature will show people that the definition of SEL has evolved, has continued to evolve over time. It started as a fairly broad definition that was inclusive of both competence development as well as context in which young people interact with adults. That is narrowed as a function of kind of a research focus. But now I think we're in the process of broadening or rebroadening the aperture to look more holistically at how social and emotional learning occurs and where it occurs.
Great. So with that, we'll pull up CASEL's new updated definition of SEL. And for those of you that are familiar with the definition, you'll see a few changes, but generally, as Rob said, we've made this a little bit broader. So I'm going to pause for just a minute and allow you to read this new definition and language that will appear on CASEL's website about what is SEL. Great. So hopefully you all had a chance to read through this, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's in there. Rob, let's start with this very first sentence that's in here that says social and emotional learning is an integral part of education and human development. Can you talk a little bit about why we felt that was an important addition here?
Well, I think, if we harken back to the history, I think that was one of the underlying working assumptions of introducing the notion of social and emotional learning. and it has emerged more recently in the work of the National Commission on Social Emotional Academic Development, also our colleagues in the Science of Learning and Development. We all are pointing to the relational nature of the human development process. And we also acknowledge that education is not solely what happens in schools, but learning happens in a range of contexts. And so it's fundamental to who human beings are and who they can become, that their cognitive, social, and emotional functioning is intimately connected.
Great, thank you. And we're going to get into the competencies and the context. Let's talk for a minute about this second paragraph that will also be on the What is SEL part of our website, that talks about SEL advancing educational equity and excellence. And it mentions school-family partnerships, learning environments, relationships. Can you say a little bit more about the importance of these partnerships and thinking about SEL as a way to co-create just and caring communities?
Sure. I think that, CASEL, as you know, Melissa, several years ago, our strategic plan pointed us towards equity, adult social and emotional learning, and academic social and emotional integration in instruction. And we felt that it was imperative to begin to broaden the aperture slightly, taking up notions of equity. I think we recognized as being terribly important historically, but more recently we've been called upon, and we felt internally that being more explicit about the connections between social and emotional learning and equity and excellence were fundamental to the healthy growth of the field. And in doing so, it begins to surface issues of inequity, how those inequities occur, interpersonal, as well as institutional relationships that could impact on both equity as well as the reproduction of inequities that are part of the current social arrangements. Authentic school, family, community partnerships we felt was important, both to articulating what the local community wants and needs in terms of how its young people develop and who they grow into, but also to ensure sustainability, right? That is, in our work, we have a variety of partnerships at the school, district, and state level that are really intended to help with capacity building, but it's really the local school community that owns that work, both in terms of defining what is so healthy social emotional development, as well as ensuring that the context support that development. So those things were very important for us to resurface and emphasize. And this issue of co-construction, I think, is important because we recognize that young people have an awful lot to offer. They have ideas about who they are and the world they'd like to see. And adults can create context where they become lifelong learners and the next generation of informed and engaged citizens by creating those kinds of environments.
Great, thank you. Let's talk for a minute about the benefits of SEL. There have been decades of research, and there's a lot more on our website about these research studies that demonstrates that when SEL programming is in place, we see not only improvements in students' social and emotional competence, but also their attitudes about themselves in school, their relationships, their academic performance, and their perceptions of their own classroom and school climate. We've seen declines in students' emotional distress, behavior problems, substance use. We've seen long-term improvements through longitudinal studies in some of these really key areas as well. And especially now that we're in a time with the pandemic, we know that these benefits are really critical for our young people. We also see that the investment in SEL is a wise one in that there is a 11-to-1 return on investment. There's a lot of information on CASEL's website about this research. Can you, Rob, share a little bit more about the evidence for SEL?
Sure. Well, as you know, a lot of the impetus for the current interest in SEL derives from the work that you described that was done um, uh, via meta-analyses that really surfaced evidence from randomized controlled trials, quasi-experimental, so rigorous experimental studies that began to surface the kind of findings you just outlined. As we've begun to kind of broaden our aperture with the growth of the field, we felt compelled to begin to try to understand scholarship more broadly as it related to social and emotional learning. And so that includes conceptual frameworks, qualitative work, um, uh, practice wisdom that can help us better understand how to position social and emotional learning as kind of a big tent enterprise, meaning more people being able to see themselves and their young people in the work of social and emotional learning. And so we've tried to uh, uh, be more inclusive in the ways in which we've understood research, as well as, you know, knowledge and knowledge production. What is evidence it has been something that we've taken up as we've tried to understand the various constituencies that might be interested in social emotional learning.
Great. And in addition to the landscape scan that was conducted to really surface all this additional research and evidence, can you share a little bit more about the future of this research, the research that you're engaged with and that the field is engaged with in better understanding the role of SEL?
Happy to do that. I think that, you know, back to this broadening of the aperture, you know, we continue to support and be very much interested in the ways in which the evidence-based has evolved, meaning there continue to be people who are doing, colleagues of ours, collaborators, who are doing large-scale randomized controlled trials. We also want to be inclusive of other forms of work, quasi-experimental, correlational studies, et cetera, where people are actually helping us to understand the nature of the competencies that various communities would like to see develop in their young people and how that development occurs. So, you know, in our own work, we've tried to frame social and emotional learning really as part of a civic development process that then allows us to understand or organize the literature to include the various ways in which communities are pursuing social emotional learning.
Great. So let's actually talk about the competencies. Most folks are familiar with the CASEL 5. This framework is probably not new to many of you, and this framework hasn't changed much from this perspective. We still have 5 broad interrelated areas of competence. You see these 2 areas in orange where we focus on the self, the 2 areas in green that we focus on others, and the yellow area on responsible decision making. Plus, we'll be talking a little bit more about these different contexts. So let's start by digging into the 5 competencies and look at a little bit about how we have decided to include additional examples and a broader definition about what is meant by each of them. So we'll start with self-awareness. In the competency of self-awareness, this is where we really think about how do I understand my own emotions, my own thoughts, my own feelings, my own actions, and how they influence each other. The examples that we are including now so that we can be more comprehensive has to do with not only understanding our own emotions, but also understanding our own personal and social identity and our personal, cultural, and linguistic assets. We've also added in here things like examining our own prejudices and biases. You'll see in here self-efficacy, a growth mindset, developing a sense of purpose. All of these are understood to be part of self-awareness. Let's look at self-management. So now we're going to be talking about what do we do with that understanding and how do we actually behave. Emily, next slide, please. This one, we're talking about our ability to manage those emotions and thoughts and behaviors in different situations. So here you're going to see managing your emotions, but you also see how you manage stress, how you stay focused and disciplined, how you not only set goals for yourself, but work towards collective goals, how you stay organized, and thinking about both personal and collective agency. The next one we're going to look at briefly is social awareness. And here we're talking about how do we understand others, and not just other individuals, but also the institutions and environments in which we are. So here we're talking about not just taking other people's perspectives, but recognizing too the way that social norms are playing out in different environments, institutional norms, the different demands that those may place on us. How do we demonstrate empathy and compassion and think about others? How do we express gratitude? And really understanding all the different ways in which these are influencing each other. The fourth area has to do with then how we actually engage with others as our relationship skills. And here we're talking about healthy communication that's effective, how we listen actively, how we work together, collaborate, problem solve together, manage conflict together. Also how we deal with negative experiences such as negative social pressure, how we can show leadership, how we can seek help when we need it, how we can offer help when we see others need it, and also thinking about how we can stand up for our own rights and the rights of others as well. And then lastly, we'll do a quick high-level overview on responsible decision making, where here we're talking about not just curiosity and open-mindedness, but how do we analyze situations and make reasoned judgments? How do we look at problems from multiple angles and identify solutions, consequences of our actions, and how they affect not only ourselves, but other groups? How do we really think critically about all of this and reflect on our own role in promoting the well-being of ourselves and others? This is all part of responsible decision making. So that was a really quick overview of some of the new ways in which we're thinking about these 5 areas. We're going to talk a little bit generally about them across all 5. So one thing we want to talk about is these are just, again, examples of ways to be thinking about these 5 areas. They are not exhaustive lists, and they include examples of competencies that are developed at very young ages, at adolescence, and also into adulthood. We're going to be talking a little bit about how we're understanding all of these as a whole. You heard in the opening remarks about how we're thinking about identity and agency and sense of belonging. Rob, can you talk a little bit about how you see these areas across the 5 competencies?
Sure. We understand those core competencies to really be in some way superordinate, meaning they're key developmental imperatives across the entire continuum. As you pointed out, Melissa, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood all have elements of agency, identity, and belonging associated with them, and people across the age range wrestle with who they are, whether and how they can be impactful, and their sense of connectedness to the people in the various contexts that they navigate. And so these have become priority considerations as we've developed our work and partners, both internal to CASEL, as well as the various partnerships that we're engaged in, research practice partnership activities to better understand competence development with a focus on identity, agency, and belonging as superordinate considerations.
And why are these areas so important as we think about SEL's role as a lever for equity and excellence, in your view?
Well, I think that, we alluded earlier to equity and the reality that if we talk about equity, we have to acknowledge inequities. I think one of the ways in which inequities occur are a function of how people are made to or encouraged to understand themselves as less than. And so it's important to surface identity, because if people are being made to feel that way or attempted to be feel that way, then someone is doing that. And so it's important that we all, across the various social categories, develop a healthy sense of who we are and how we ought to interact with others if we're moving towards a sense of belonging for all participants or all stakeholders in whatever environment we're in. And agency becomes important because the effort that's put forward to help build those environments is in some ways fundamental to healthy human functioning.
Agreed. And as we think about these areas too, you'll notice in the new ways in which we're describing the competencies that we're trying to be more explicit about thinking not just about the individual, but the collective. So when we think about agency, we think about individual agency as well as collective agency. And when we think about problem solving, we think about the consequences not just to us, but also to others. And I think this way of really understanding ourselves and also how our actions, our thoughts, our beliefs, and our engagements can impact everyone around us is much more clearly defined in the way in which we're now understanding and communicating about social and emotional learning.
Well, and Melissa, that's one of the reasons why anchoring this work in civic development or civic life is so very important, because that helps us accentuate the relationships among people and people's relationships to institutions.
Yeah, great. So in thinking about that, let's also talk about the rings around the competencies, which many folks tend to not spend as much time there. They know the Castle 5, they're familiar with the wheel, but really haven't examined the different contexts. And we know that social and emotional learning is promoted all day, every day. And so we want to really be mindful of the different ways that we can be intentional about promoting positive social and emotional development in the different contexts. Castle's framework is really about taking a systemic approach that is designed to coordinate across these different environments so that we can really be promoting social and emotional competence in the classroom, and not only in the classroom, also in the ways in which we are interacting in schools and the policies that exist there, the ways that we are connecting with families and what's happening there, and also with our community partners. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about some of these settings too, to understand how they are connected and why the environment is so important. So let's just start by talking about the environment in general. And what is this? When we talk about the environment, we're really talking about the others, the adults, and the systems that make up those environments. So Rob, can you talk a little bit about the importance of the context and the environment in promoting SEL?
Yes. So I think you put your finger on it, Melissa. When we, in our strategic plan, began to think about adult social and emotional learning, it was primarily as a way to better emphasize the importance of the environment, that adults really have a lead role in trying to set environments that allow for and support and sustain the healthy development of each other, as well as the young people that they are charged with as they move in and out of context. And the other piece I think that you pointed to that should be emphasized is that we typically think about adults in the SEL world as being classroom teachers or maybe even administrators, but it's much broader than that from our way of thinking about it, that all of the adults in a classroom or school environment are implicated in the healthy development of one another, as well as the young people. But then extending beyond that, the ways in which families connect to the school institution and connect with each other, as well as families being situated in communities and community youth serving organizations also being important environments for healthy development of young people.
Yes, and for those of you that are familiar with our model previously, you may have noticed a change in how we're describing these rings. We've gone from 3 rings to 4 rings. And the difference here is that we actually separated families and caregivers into their own space from communities, because what we've recognized is that each of those play such important and significant roles for our young people, and by putting them together, we were maybe watering down the impact of the unique contribution that they each make. So specifically for families, we have learned in our work and through our understanding of creating equitable learning environments just how important authentic partnerships are with families, in that it contributes significantly to the issues you mentioned before about identity development. It's difficult to really affirm identities without really understanding the identities that our young people have and how they are situated in their families and in their own cultures. Can you share a little bit more about the important role that families play and how we can connect with them more authentically?
Well, great points about really families serving as really the first learning context for young people as they grow. The relationship changes over time just as a function of the young person's development, but it's terribly important that schools and people in schools are connected in meaningful ways with families so that the adults can be aligned in terms of what is desired, what is expected, and how to support that healthy development. Typically, too typically, schools invite parents in superficial ways rather than really partnering with them in support of their young people. So we emphasize, as you point out, Melissa, authentic partnerships which have families involved from the beginning of the process of implementing systemic SEL, which I know we'll talk about later.
Yes, and the family piece is so important, as you pointed out, to not be superficial, but to be a two-way street, really not just pushing information out to families about how things are going in school, but really listening to families and hearing from them about their contributions to the conversation around what's best for their own children. Additionally, we know community partners can play an important role. There are so many wonderful ways, especially we've seen in recent months, as schools have had to really rely on community partners. We see how important of a role they play in promoting the social and emotional learning of students, both those community partners that are partnering with us during the school day, as well as those in our communities that are working with children in out of school time spaces. They also have a meaningful role to play and have been really key partners in promoting the social and emotional growth of our young people. So that's another interesting change to how we're now talking about it, that we've separated those two. What we're going to do next is talk a little bit about how you actually do this. And while this webinar is not going to detail all the ways in which we accomplish systemic SEL, we are going to just give a little bit of information and invite you to learn more about this on our website. So this model that you see here represents a systemic approach to SEL, but it's kind of abstract. And so what we've learned from schools is that they need more understanding and clarity around, so if I'm doing this, if I am promoting intentionally these competencies in classrooms, in schools, with families, with communities, what would that actually look like? So in getting to the concrete, you can see on this next piece here that CASEL has identified 10 indicators of school-wide SEL that really represent what a systemic approach to social and emotional learning looks like in a school. The first one listed here, explicit SEL instruction, is critically important. We do agree that having time set aside to explicitly teach SEL skills, whether it's stress management or how to recognize emotions or how to work in a group, that explicit instruction is critically important. But it's not sufficient. We know that there are other ways that we want to be intentional about promoting social and emotional learning, such as integrating social and emotional learning with our academic instruction, which means that we are really working to think through how we're promoting social and emotional competence while teaching math, while teaching science, social studies, or language arts. So in addition to those two, we know also that giving youth opportunities to have youth voice and engagement and some power and control and decision making around their classroom environment and their school environment is a critically important way to affirm those youth and get them to be leaders. We know also that the classroom and school climate is critically important, which is something that many of our schools are focused on promoting a positive school climate, and that has to do with the structures in place and also the ways in which kids feel going through class and through the school building. The focus on adult SEL, as Rob mentioned, is a key piece when we're thinking about our environments. And this has to do with the adults that work with our youth. Are they given opportunities to develop their own social and emotional competence? Are they given opportunities to develop relationships and trusting community with each other? And are they also intentionally modeling for our young people those social and emotional competencies that we want our young people to learn? So modeling is critically important. Supportive discipline is also a key piece so that we are taking not such a punitive approach, but an approach that allows students to reflect on choices, to have empathy for how actions may have affected others, and to process through that is a really key piece for growth. A continuum for integrated supports has to do with, are we thinking about ways that we can provide support to all students as well as students that need additional support, not unlike you would do if you were thinking about academic areas. You would want to make sure that your social and emotional programming has elements for all kids as well as additional supports for kids that may need additional interventions in your MTSS framework. And then the family partnerships and community partnerships, we already talked about the importance of really having those be authentic and aligned. And then lastly, but of course not least, how do we constantly evaluate what we're doing and if that's working and if it needs to be adjusted? So really committing to systems for continuous improvement so that we can see if the work that we're doing is impacting how our kids are perceiving their school environment, how they are doing academically, how they're attending, and how their social and emotional competence is growing. So these are the things that you would see in a school that is really focused on a systemic approach. And it may look a little overwhelming or like a lot to do. On CASEL's website, you'll find guidance on how to assess your own school in these areas through a rubric, and also how to organize yourselves to work to grow in these areas in CASEL's Guide to School-Wide SEL. And we'll be sure to send you a link to that, all those free resources after this webinar. So that's just a brief overview of the key indicators, but let's talk for a minute about how all of these fit together in CASEL's model. So CASEL's model for we call this our theory of action, is this framework here. So I'm just going to actually read this from right to left. We talked in the beginning about what are the outcomes that research tells us we can expect when we focus on social and emotional learning, and you can see both short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes, everything from improvements about how students are feeling in the school climate, all the way to longer-term outcomes around healthy relationships, graduation rates, and so forth. So that's the why of why we're committed to this. The what and the where is what we just spent the most of our time talking about, which is how we're promoting the social and emotional competence in these different environments. And then lastly, the how on the left, this is CASEL's theory of action, and this is actually has applications at the school, at the district, and at the state level, where we look at these 4 areas. So how do we begin by building a foundational support, buy-in, community stakeholder engagement? How do we get all of that initial support and develop a shared vision and plan is the first area. The second area has to do with what supports will we put in place so that we can strengthen adults and their own social and emotional competency development, their own expertise, their own capacity to deliver high quality instruction. Third, what are the specific things that we're going to put in place to promote SEL for our students? And then lastly, how will we be looking at data and continuously improving all along the way? So Rob, I just want to ask you to kind of share any overarching comments about the updated definition, how this fits into the theory of action, and what we're hoping to learn about as we continue for this work in our understanding of how social emotional learning can support both equity and excellence.
Sure. Thanks, Melissa. As you pointed out, this is an introduction or reintroduction of our work and how it's evolved over time. We've put forward notions like transformative SEL as ways of emphasizing SEL as a lever for equity and excellence. We've worked here to try to better integrate that framing into the general thrust of our work. We have formed a number of internal partnerships. So we work from the perspective of research practice partnership internal to CASEL. So Melissa's team and my team and our policy team work very closely together to try to breathe life into this work in the various districts and states we work in. We also have external partners, and I'll mention a couple of them, National Equity Project and University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. PERTS is also a partner of ours, and we're situated in a larger Bell network. So we have established and evolved a number of partnerships that will allow us to really develop systematic understanding of the types of working assumptions that we put forward to help push and grow the field in ways that serve the broadest number of children possible in an increasingly complex and diverse society.
And while we're on the topic of partnerships, we also have been informed greatly by the partnerships we have with our 18 large urban districts that are part of our Collaborating Districts initiative, who have significantly informed how we understand district-wide and school-wide SEL implementation, as well as our Collaborating States initiative, where CASEL is partnering with 40 states to help them think through how they can create the conditions within their states so that districts and schools can really prioritize and implement this work. So we will be continuing with those partnerships, continuing with our research, and continuing to update how we understand and share with you our best thinking about social and emotional competence, how it is developed, and how it can create a long-term outcomes for a more caring and just society. And now we actually have a little bit of time to take some of the most commonly asked questions.
So how do these definitional updates connect to work CASEL has done around transformative SEL?
So I'll jump in with that. We're thinking carefully about the ways in which these kinds of conceptual advances inform all of our tools and resources and the like. There's some working assumptions implicit in or explicit in our work around transformative social emotional learning, and they have begun to show up, for example, in the definitions of competencies that we just shared, the emphases within our work within districts, the ways in which we have rolled out our theory of action in places where equity is a primary focus. And so our work is really intended to test some of the assumptions. We are an evidence-based organization and believe deeply that it's important, just as we alluded to earlier, to really utilize a continuous improvement process to refine our frameworks, the work that we do in the field, and provide evidence of the influences and impacts of the work that we're doing.
And I think a lot of our district partners and states that are excited about SEL in service of equity as a priority for them will really be pleased to see how that work around transformative SEL has informed the way that CASEL has updated our definitions.
And to that point, Melissa, I think it's important to add that many of our partners have been pushing forward with this type of work themselves. And so it is really, to your earlier point, a kind of a bi-directional learning process. And we appreciate the work that they've been doing, and we're anxious to be a full-fledged partner in that work.
Are there specific SEL curriculums that are recommended, or are there resources to suggest that you can suggest to help us select an SEL curricula?
Well, just as I suggested earlier, we're in the process of revising our program review. The program review and the guide have functioned as pivotal resources for the field. And as our definitions evolve, so do the ways in which we apply those definitions in our review processes. And so there are some tenets or some principles that we deem to be extremely important in the context of SEL in the service of equity and excellence. And those core features would include things like focusing on young people's lived experience. Certainly student voice is a related characteristic. Scaffolding, we believe, is an important aspect of that, and the integration of academic, social, and emotional instruction based on a good understanding of young people's input around their lived experiences and things that are important to them in their school community.
Okay, we're shifting focus to what does SEL look like when we're working in remote and virtual environments, as so many of us are these days?
Yes, we have been getting that question quite a bit, and there's a couple of things I would point our folks to. On CASEL's website, there is a place that says COVID resources, where we have pulled together a number of different resources to support schools. And as Rob just mentioned, many of the program providers that are in CASEL's guide to selecting evidence-based programs have offered assistance with this. In fact, you'll find that many of them have offered free lessons for schools to implement during this period. More generally speaking, though, the way in which we are helping schools and districts think about promoting SEL while working remotely mirrors the way that we would encourage them to think about this even during times where we're together. So if you look actually at the slide that is still up, when we think about building foundational support and planning, this is critically important when we're working remotely, that we are really doing a good job of establishing strong communications systems with all of our stakeholders, especially as people are not coming together in person. We need to make sure we have robust systems for communication. We need to make sure that we're providing professional learning for teachers around the importance of social and emotional learning and how to provide SEL during remote learning, and really just need to make sure that we are have a team that is dedicated to this work. So if you haven't already identified an SEL team, it's important to find some folks within the district that can lead this work. On this second group, strengthening adult SEL competence and capacities, this has never been more important. We know that our adults in our districts and schools are also suffering from this pandemic and experiencing trauma, and we really need to make sure that we are attending to the adults' needs, providing them with opportunities to get the support that they need, providing them with opportunities to collaborate and build relationships with each other and support each other, and really remembering that this is a significant amount of stress on the teachers and the adults in our buildings, and really making sure that we're prioritizing that and prioritizing the professional learning and support that they need so that they are healthy and able to provide good support for kids. So in this third bucket, promote SEL for students, the way in which you might do this, which might be slightly different during remote learning, there's a couple of key things to keep in mind. One is that we really do want to support the relationship building, and that goes for the adults as well. So the relationship between adults, the relationships between adults and students, and the relationships between students and students. And sometimes when we're working remotely, it's difficult to use technology. We aren't as accustomed to it, but really trying to prioritize opportunities for kids to have an opportunity to talk, to do partner activities, to work in groups, to have opportunities to talk about how they're feeling about what's happening, whether it's the pandemic or racial injustices, creating spaces for kids to be able to talk about these things and connect with each other is critically important. Also, of course, we want to give them opportunities to build these skills. Again, those program providers can be very helpful, but really helping them with strategies for managing stress and breathing techniques, or if it's about how to process these difficult emotions. It's a really important time not to forget about these explicit instruction in these key pieces. And then lastly, with respect to continuous improvement, this is all very new for all of us. So making sure that we're taking opportunities to ask kids, teachers, families, principals, how is this going and how can we do it better? Really making sure that we're checking in with each other regularly to see if it's working, and if it's not working, what we can do to continuously improve, and really making sure that that's part of our process and not just barreling forward without reflecting on if this is working and who is it working for.
Got time for one more question, and we'll talk a little bit about where does assessment or measurement of social and emotional competence fit into this discussion?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think the last point that Melissa made around continuous improvement and getting the perspectives of students, caregivers, as well as educators, I think is part and parcel of a portfolio of assessments that we would encourage folks to utilize. Certainly, we would expect growth and improvement in social and emotional competencies. And, as we've alluded to earlier, those competencies range and can be reflective of issues of identity, agency, and belonging, for example. But the larger issue, I think, is the alignment between the framework or the vision that you have, the program that you select, the professional development that's utilized to support the implementation of the program, and determining the connection among all those things to the desired outcomes of the program. So while we have emphasized in the past, there's been a great deal of emphasis on the assessment of young people, I think a broader research and evaluation strategy would include those outcomes, but not overly focus on those, but better understand how implementation quality informs young people's experiences with the programs and thereby impacts things like engagement, which then lead to outcomes, including academic growth.
Yeah, and I would just add that there are lots of ways to assess the impact of your work, as Rob pointed out. And the social and emotional competence assessment is one way. CASEL also has provided on our website an assessment guide, so you can see the different tools that are out there for measuring social and emotional competence. But I would also just caution, as Rob did, about how to use that data is really important. The goal of social and emotional competence data should be formative to help schools think about where they want to focus as a school. It should not be used in a way that could lead to pathologizing students or screening them and putting them into some sort of label, some labeling or remedial program. So there's a lot of guidance in that guide about not just what tools are out there, but what's the best way to use that data for formative reasons. And also, as he pointed out, when we see programming and social emotional learning, you'll see that show up in lots of different kinds of ways, not just SE competence data, but also you'll see climate data improve. We've seen attendance data improve. We've seen academic engagement and academic performance improve. And I would encourage schools to think about climate data, especially as reported by students themselves. Do they feel that sense of belonging? Do they feel that school is a place that is safe? Those kinds of questions are great ways for them to see the impact of their work.